There are relationships that do not fall apart because of a lack of love, but because two people are operating from entirely different inner structures. You hear them say, "I love you," not casually, not superficially, even quite convincingly. Yet the deeper the bond becomes, the more you begin to sense a quiet paradox. Each time you grow calmer, more self-directed, more truthful with yourself, the atmosphere between the two of you grows heavier, more closed, more suffocating. There is no need for major conflict or obvious drama, just a subtle, persistent feeling that your presence, once it is no longer anxious or dependent, begins to disorient the other person and leave them without bearings. It is precisely at this point that many empaths begin to doubt themselves. They wonder whether they are changing in the wrong way, whether they are becoming cold or distant, or whether love, by its very nature, always demands continuous self-sacrifice in order to be preserved. But when you look more deeply, the issue was never that you loved too little or loved incorrectly. The issue is that your way of loving, rooted in presence and authenticity, has come into contact with an inner structure that cannot tolerate the truth. Through a Jungian lens, there are people who exist primarily through the persona, the psychological mask constructed to adapt, to be validated, and above all, to avoid confronting the inner void. For them, love is not a meeting between two mature selves, but a mechanism for regulating the ego, a way of borrowing another person to keep a fragile inner structure from collapsing. Empaths, by contrast, do not love in order to fill a lack. They love through the capacity to remain, to listen, and to be fully present with what is real even when that reality is uncomfortable. And it is this difference that creates the central paradox of the relationship. Authentic presence does not only bring a sense of being understood, it also draws what has been denied up to the surface. It stirs the shadow, gives voice to fragments that were never integrated within the other person. As a result, a narcissist may say love to you, but at a deeper level of inner experience. What they feel is not peace, but a form of existential envy, not because you are superior, but because you are living in a state they can only perform, never truly access. This video does not aim to judge or to explain surface-level behaviors. It moves into a deeper paradox. Why those who lack the capacity to love are most powerfully drawn to those who love authentically, and why this very attraction causes them to both need you in order to survive and resist you in order to protect their ego structure. When you understand this, you stop searching for answers in whether you were good enough. You begin to see clearly that some people say love, not because they are loving, but because they need your presence to avoid facing themselves. Part 1. The narcissist does not love you. They love the state you make them feel. The greatest misunderstanding that keeps empaths trapped for so long in relationships with narcissists lies here. They believe they are being loved, when in reality they are being used as a psychological environment. A narcissist does not bond with you as an independent person, but with the way they feel in your presence. It may be the feeling of being understood without having to explain, of being listened to without being questioned, of being allowed to exist without having to confront the distorted or fractured parts within themselves. The empath, through natural, unguarded presence, unintentionally becomes a temporary refuge for an ego that cannot stand on its own. In the depth psychology of Carl Jung, the narcissist lives primarily through the persona, a structure designed to function outwardly, not to engage with authentic inner life. The persona requires feedback, validation, and a surface soft enough to reflect the image it wants to believe is me. The empath, with heightened sensitivity and unconditional acceptance, becomes the perfect mirror for that mask. In your presence, the narcissist feels valuable, profound, even as if they possess a soul, but it is a borrowed soul, not one that is truly lived. For this reason, when a narcissist says love, they are not lying in the conventional sense. They are genuinely attached to the experience you provide. The problem is that this experience has little to do with who you are, and everything to do with how you make their fragile inner structure feel less empty. Love, in this context, is not a meeting between two mature selves, but a one-sided form of emotional regulation. You become the place where they unload, the surface in which they reflect themselves, the space where they can temporarily forget the nameless void they never dare to face. The tragedy is this: empaths love through presence, which makes it difficult to recognize that they are being bound to an unconscious role. You interpret this closeness as connection, their need for you as proof of love. But the longer you stay, the more you find yourself stabilizing the other person, dimming your own light, regulating your emotions so as not to disturb them. These are signs that the relationship no longer revolves around two people, but around maintaining an inner structure that cannot sustain itself. Part 2. When the empath stops trying, envy awakens and the narcissist's shadow begins to speak. The most important phase shift in this relationship does not begin with conflict, nor does it begin with separation. It begins with something far more difficult to notice. The empath stops trying, not stopping love, not becoming indifferent, but stopping the unconscious assumption of responsibility for regulating the other person's emotional state. You no longer monitor every expression, no longer explain yourself to prevent misunderstandings, no longer place the center of your psychological life in keeping the relationship stable. On the surface, you are still there. Internally, however, a central pillar has been quietly withdrawn. This very moment activates a profound reaction within the narcissist's unconscious structure. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, anything that is not made conscious does not disappear. It is pushed into the shadow. The narcissist carries a particular kind of shadow, not explosive rage or overt malice, but a fundamental deficit in the capacity for self-connection. At its core lies an early, deep sense of emptiness and a persistent fear that without being mirrored, they will not exist as someone. Wases. As long as the empath plays the role of regulator, this shadow remains covered not because it is gone, but because it is soothed by your presence. You become the reflective surface, the external regulating system that allows the narcissist to avoid confronting the inner void. But when you withdraw your energy, when you stop keeping rhythm for them, the shadow can no longer be held beneath the surface. It begins to stir. And the first emotion that emerges is not fear nor sadness, it is envy. Here, a clear distinction must be made. Envy is not the same as jealousy. Jealousy is tied to the fear of losing something one already possesses. It still acknowledges the other person's independent existence, merely fearing replacement. Envy is different. Envy is not about loss, but about the fact that the other person inhabits a state of being that one does not have and cannot obtain through imitation or possession. Envy does not say, "I'm afraid of losing you," but rather, "I cannot tolerate that you live in a state I cannot access." The narcissist does not envy the empath because you are more capable, more successful, or more visible. Those are things they can compete with, simulate, or appropriate. What they envy is the inner foundation. You can be alone without collapsing. You can feel sadness without dramatizing it. You can stand in silence without needing validation. For the empath, this is the result of a painful but genuine maturation process. For the narcissist, it is living proof of a lack they have spent a lifetime denying. For this reason, the narcissist's envy is never named correctly. At the conscious level, they will not say, "I envy your state of being." Instead, they say you have changed, that you are colder, more distant, no longer the same. But at a deeper level, what is happening is an unconscious comparison between two psychological structures. One that has learned self-regulation and emotional integration, and one that can only function through external control and reflection. Each time you fail to react according to the old script, each time you remain calm in the face of familiar triggers, envy is reactivated with greater intensity. This envy is not loud. It is corrosive. It causes the narcissist to experience your presence not as supportive, but as exposing. You do nothing at all, yet the simple fact that you no longer need becomes an existential offense. And because the narcissist lacks the capacity to turn inward and face the shadow, they are forced to process this feeling externally. From this point on, the relationship begins to change color. The need for you is no longer pure, it becomes mixed with irritation. Intimacy no longer brings safety. It becomes a site for subtle attack. The narcissist may not understand what is happening, but they feel it clearly. You are no longer holding their structure together. Love begins to lose its protective function, and envy, the emotion that cannot be acknowledged, gradually becomes the hidden driver. It is precisely here that the shadow truly begins to speak, not through words, but through impulses to control, through discomfort with your calm, through the urge to do something, to pull you out of a state they cannot enter. And from this envy, strategies begin to form not to love, but to reclaim existential power. The next part of the story is where envy no longer remains silent, but transforms into behavior. Part 3. When envy becomes the driving force. The narcissist's tactics when they cannot tolerate your stability. When envy passes the threshold of a fleeting emotion, it no longer exists as a passive feeling. At this stage, envy becomes the engine driving the narcissist's entire behavior. It is not loud, dramatic jealousy, but a quiet, cold, and strategic force. The narcissist no longer asks, "What am I feeling?" but unconsciously shifts to a different question. How do I disrupt the state the other person is standing in? What must be clearly understood is this: the narcissist cannot tolerate your calm. The empath's calm is not merely external quiet. It is a sign of an inner structure that has begun to stand on its own. And to the narcissist, this is profoundly threatening. If you no longer waver, there's nothing left for them to hook into. If you no longer react, they lose their power. Envy here is not aimed at possessing you, but at knocking you off balance. The first and most common tactic is gaslighting. But gaslighting at this stage is no longer crude. It is not blatant denial of reality, but a subtle distortion of your experience. The narcissist begins planting seemingly harmless questions. Do you feel like you've changed lately? I feel like you're not the same anymore. Do you think someone is influencing you? These questions are not meant to understand you. They are meant to erode your trust in your own perceptions. Each time you pause to self-check, each time you wonder whether you are being too rigid or too cold, the narcissist achieves their first objective, pulling you out of self-sovereignty. Alongside gaslighting comes blame, but not loud, overt blame. It is moralized, implicit blame. The narcissist begins framing you as the cause of the rupture. You are the one who changed. You are the one who stopped trying. You are the one who made the relationship no longer what it used to be. What makes this dangerous is that empaths are naturally inclined towards self-reflection. The narcissist exploits this very strength, turning it into a vulnerability. They do not need to prove you wrong. They only need you to doubt yourself long enough. When gaslighting and blame are no longer sufficient to pull you back into reaction, the narcissist moves to a deeper layer: projection. Everything they cannot bear to see within themselves, dependency, emptiness, fear of abandonment, inner helplessness, is placed onto you. You are labeled controlling, while it is they who cannot tolerate losing control. You are called cold, while it is they who cannot access authentic emotion. You are accused of selfishness, when all you are doing is reclaiming your energy for self-protection. Projection offers the narcissist temporary relief because it allows them to throw their shadow outward rather than contain it. But once envy becomes the central motive, The narcissist never operates alone. At a certain point, they activate the flying monkeys. This is when the story leaves the private space between two people and spreads into the surrounding environment. The narcissist begins telling their version of events to friends, family members, colleagues, or influential figures in the shared social circle. This is not an honest account. It is a narrative designed to generate silent consensus that you are the problem. You are portrayed as erratic, ungrateful, emotionally difficult, or negatively influenced. The purpose of flying monkeys is not merely to damage your image, but to isolate you within your own experience. When people around you begin repeating the same message, that you are too sensitive, too demanding, too distant, you may start to invalidate yourself. The narcissist understands this well. If they cannot destabilize you from the inside on their own, they will use the crowd to do it for them. Envy has now fully transformed into a psychological campaign. The most disturbing aspect of this phase is that the narcissist does not need to consciously hate you. They may still say they care, that they are concerned, that they just want things to be better, but beneath that language lies a clear drive. If you cannot return to your old position, then you must be made wrong. Because your existence in a self-directed state is living proof of something the narcissist refuses to face, that there is another way to live, one not based on manipulation, control, or borrowing identity from others. In Jungian depth psychology, this is the point at which the shadow fully takes over. The narcissist is no longer acting from the social persona, but from an activated, unintegrated shadow complex. When the shadow operates without consciousness, it does not seek truth. It seeks discharge. And the fastest discharge is to break the person who makes it feel existentially inferior. For the empath, this is the phase most likely to exhaust you if you do not recognize the nature of the game. You may feel trapped in a maze where every move turns against you. If you speak, you are labeled defensive. If you stay silent, you are labeled cold. If you withdraw, you are accused of running away. But this very sense that there is no right move is the clearest sign that you are no longer in a relationship, you are inside a power structure driven by envy. The deeper truth is this: the narcissist does not want you to suffer for the sake of your suffering. They want you to lose your center, because only when you lose your center can they temporarily feel stable. Envy at this point is no longer comparison, it is fear of exposure. And every tactic, gaslighting, blame, projection, flying monkeys, serves a single purpose: to pull you out of self-sovereignty so they do not have to face their own emptiness. If you are in this phase and feel exhausted, confused, or wonder why everything has suddenly become so complicated, understand that what is happening is not because you loved incorrectly, but because you have begun to step out of the unconscious role the narcissist required. And that moment, painful as it is the clearest sign that you are moving toward freedom while they remain trapped in the very shadow they refuse to face. Part 4. When love is replaced by control. The narcissist does not want you close, they want you below. Once envy has become the underlying driver and manipulative strategies are in motion, the relationship enters a decisive phase. Love no longer occupies the central role. What replaces it is control. Not overt domination at first, but a microsystem of adjustments, tests, and reactions designed to pull you back into your former position, the position where you once soothed, mirrored, and upheld their fragile inner structure. At this stage, the narcissist is no longer seeking intimacy in the sense of connection. They are seeking position. What they need is not proximity to you, but certainty that you do not stand above them existentially. For the narcissist, the most terrifying distance is not emotional separation, but inner distance, the place where you can remain grounded within yourself while they cannot. Through a Jungian lens, this is the moment when the persona can no longer provide sufficient cover and the shadow begins to govern behavior. When the shadow operates without consciousness, It does not seek truth or reconciliation. It seeks a hierarchy of power. The narcissist must re-establish an order in which they are central. Their emotions set the standard, and your inner state revolves around them for the system to function. You will notice concrete shifts. They speak less about their own feelings and more about your behavior, what you should do, what you should not do, how you are no longer the same. These remarks are not meant for dialogue, they are meant for repositioning. Each judgment is an attempt to place you back within their frame of reference. If you accept that frame, control is restored. If you refuse it, conflict escalates. The subtlety lies in this. The narcissist does not need you to collapse completely. They only need you to waver enough to re-enter reaction. A little explaining, a little justifying, a little effort to prove that you still care. Those small fragments are enough for the old system to continue operating. This is why boundaries are constantly tested. At times they grow cold to make you chase. At times they appear needy to pull you back in. This is not emotional inconsistency. It is behavioral calibration. At this point, empaths often mistake control for concern. You may believe they act this way because they fear losing you. The deeper truth, however, is that they fear losing position. If you stay while no longer revolving around them, that is more threatening than your departure. Your self-directed presence exposes an unbearable reality. They cannot maintain their sense of self without placing someone beneath them. As a result, the narcissist begins to renegotiate love not through words, but through conditions. Love becomes contingent on compliance, care becomes contingent on reaction, peace becomes contingent on you shrinking yourself. This is where many empaths feel the most exhausted and confused, because they can sense clearly that the relationship is no longer a space for presence, but a stage for correct performance. If you continue to stand firm and refuse to enter this control game, the narcissist experiences a form of silent crisis, not the grief of loss, but the sensation of being pushed outside the system. And for a structure that survives by occupying the psychological space of others, being outside the system equals existential disorientation. That is why, at this stage, control ceases to be a choice, it becomes a survival reflex. This phase of the journey reveals an uncomfortable yet liberating truth. The narcissist does not abandon love in order to become cruel. They were never in love in the sense of an equal meeting to begin with. When envy rises and control replaces care, what is exposed is not a personality shift, but the true nature of the relationship from the start. And once you see this clearly enough, you understand why your self-sovereignty is not merely a personal choice, but something the narcissist cannot tolerate, because it dismantles the entire order they require in order to exist. Part 5. When the empath no longer stays, envy turns into obsession. When the empath no longer reacts along the old trajectories, no longer adjusts themselves to fit the system of control, the narcissist enters a state very different from what outsiders usually imagine. This is not the sorrow of loss, nor regret colored by affection. What they experience is an unfillable void, because what has been lost is not merely a person, but a mechanism of existence. At this stage, envy no longer needs to be triggered by your presence. It becomes self-sustaining. Even after you have withdrawn from their life, the state you once embodied continues to exist in the narcissist's mind as a disturbing point of reference. You become an unconscious standard, the one who remained intact without them, the one who left without collapsing, the one who stepped out of a role they themselves never dared to abandon. For this reason, you cannot be erased from their inner structure. The narcissist may quickly find new supply. They may enter another relationship, appear busy, successful, admired, but what unfolds externally never touches the core issue. A new person may reduce their loneliness, but cannot recreate the deep stabilizing state the empath once provided. And the more they attempt to fill the void from the outside, the sharper the contrast becomes. Noise on the outside, emptiness within. It is precisely in this gap that envy transforms into obsession. This obsession is not romantic in nature. The narcissist does not miss you out of love, but because you are living proof of something they do not possess. They miss the state they once had in your presence, the feeling of, I am someone, I am okay, I am being held. But when you leave in self-sovereignty, that state can no longer be reactivated. And what cannot be reactivated becomes impossible to forget. At a deeper level, the narcissist cannot accept your departure as an independent choice. They interpret it as a negation of their value. This adds another layer to the obsession, the need to rewrite the story. They must believe you left because of weakness, because of injury, because of external influence, any explanation that does not involve the truth that you outgrew their structure. Each time you live well, live peacefully, live without the need to prove anything, that narrative is threatened. This is why the narcissist continues to monitor from a distance. Not to return immediately, but to check. Are you still who you were before? Have you collapsed? Have you fallen back into the old cycle? Every sign that you remain grounded reactivates envy, not as rage, but as continuous internal friction. You do not need to appear. It is enough that you do not break. For the empath, this phase is often experienced as a deep quiet, not because everything has been resolved, but because you are no longer participating in that structure. Yet this very quiet, from the narcissist's perspective, is the most provocative thing of all. It offers no opportunity to regain control through manipulation and no escape through drama. It forces them to remain with themselves, something they have avoided their entire lives. The narcissist's obsession, therefore, is not a sign that you are special in a romantic sense. It is the inevitable consequence of your withdrawal from the unconscious role they needed in order to exist. When the empath no longer stays, envy does not disappear. It freezes, becoming a permanent point of tension within the narcissist's inner structure. And that point of tension is a constant reminder that there was another path, a path they could see but could not step into. Part 6. The liberating truth. The narcissist's envy is not your curse, but their limit. At this stage, the most important thing the empath needs to understand is no longer found in analyzing what the narcissist will do next, but in realigning one's own axis of perception. Without this shift, you may continue to carry an invisible burden, the sense that you are special in a destructive way, that your existence triggered something dangerous, or worse, that if you had loved differently, more gently, more softly, things might not have unfolded this way. This is the final residue of the structure the narcissist leaves behind. The deeper and harder truth is this. The narcissist's envy has nothing to do with your fault or your merit. It is about a structural limitation. You did not make them envious. You simply arrived at a state they cannot reach. In Carl Jung's language, this is the point at which one individual has begun the process of integration, where emotional life, shadow material, and consciousness are no longer fragmented, while the other continues to live through a split between persona and shadow. These two paths do not clash out of hostility. They clash because they cannot coexist within the same power-based order. Empaths often believe the narcissist cannot tolerate their happiness. But what they cannot tolerate is not happiness. It is self-sovereignty. Happiness may provoke jealousy. Self-sovereignty provokes envy. Self-sovereignty cannot be taken, manipulated, or conditioned. It exists as a stark reality. You do not need them in order to stand. And this shatters the central illusion the narcissist depends on to survive, that they are the reference point of the emotional world around them. When you understand this deeply enough, an important inner movement occurs. You stop wanting to be properly understood by the narcissist. You stop hoping they will see your pain or acknowledge their role in it. Not because you have hardened, but because you recognize that such recognition cannot come from a structure incapable of self-reflection. Expecting it only keeps you within the gravitational pull of envy. At this point, many empaths begin to experience a kind of stillness unlike anything before. Not superficial calm, but a conscious withdrawal from another person's psychological stage. You no longer need to react to prove you are not wrong. You no longer need to retell the story to be believed. You understand that your peace does not depend on the narcissist changing, but on you no longer functioning as an extension of their structure. The liberating truth lies here. The narcissist's envy only has power while you remain within their field of reflection. When you step out, envy does not disappear, but it no longer has a target. It turns back to where it originated. The inner void the narcissist never learned to face. This is not a moral punishment. It is the natural consequence of a structure built on control rather than consciousness. This part closes with a crucial reversal. You do not need to defeat the narcissist. You do not need to prove that you were right. The moment you stop participating, stop adjusting, stop carrying the unconscious role, the game ends at a structural level. And when the game ends, what remains is not hatred, but a cold, freeing clarity. You have moved into a level of existence that envy cannot reach, because envy only survives in relationships that still require power. In the end, the most important thing in this entire journey is not how long the narcissist envies you, how they manipulate, or how persistent their obsession remains. All of that, painful and chaotic as it may be, still belongs only to the surface movement of an inner structure that has become stuck. The true center of the story has always been elsewhere, quieter but decisive. You withdrew from the role they needed you to occupy. In Jungian depth psychology, some relationships do not end because love is lacking, but because one person begins to integrate themselves while the other does not. When you stop living as a mirror, stop functioning as the regulating system for an ego that cannot stand on its own, you are not abandoning anyone. You are simply returning to the other person the responsibility of facing themselves, something they have avoided their entire life. At this point, every paradox becomes clear. The narcissist says, love not because they love, but because they need. When you are there to reflect them, love can be maintained as a function. When you withdraw in self-sovereignty, love loses its utility, and what rises to replace it is envy. Not envy because you are superior, but because you have learned how to live without borrowing an identity from another. Understanding this is deeply liberating. You no longer need to carry guilt for having triggered something in them. You no longer have to ask whether you were too bright, too strong, or too different. The truth is simple. You did not make them envious. You simply reached a level of existence they cannot enter, and that is neither your fault nor your responsibility to soften by staying. When the empath truly understands this, a quiet transformation occurs. You stop seeking love from someone who does not have the capacity to love. You stop needing recognition from a structure that exists only through reflection. You begin returning to what is most essential, living in your own wholeness, even if that means walking a stretch of the path without anyone holding your hand. And perhaps this is the most honest conclusion of all. You did not leave to punish the narcissist, and they do not obsess over you out of love. Two people simply came to stand on opposite sides of inner maturity. One chose to face, integrate, and take responsibility for their inner life. The other continues to seek stability from the outside. When those paths diverge, envy appears not as a curse, but as a sign that you no longer belong to the old world. And from that moment on, quietly, without spectacle, real power has changed hands. Not because you defeated anyone, but because you no longer need to participate in the game.